inspired by the commitment first in quality around the world. These days when people talk about models, the natural assumption is that they are talking about models made of plastic. But did you know that the history of plastic models is surprisingly short? In Japan, they were first produced as recently as the late 1950s. Before the advent of plastic, models were made out of wood. And in this video, I will share with you the story of a Japanese company that was started as a lumber seller and transformed into a master modeler. In 1942, it was wartime. In Shizuoka, Japan, there was a young boy named Shunsaku Tamiya. At the age of 8 in his second year of elementary school, the Japanese Ministry of Education had made assembling wooden aircraft and warship models a part of the handicraft curriculum. This experience of making educational models at school served to introduce the children of that time to the world of model making. Prior to World War II, his father, Mr. Yoshio Tamiya, had run his own transportation business. But in the massive bombing raids on Shizuoka, the entire business literally went up in smoke. After the war, his father switched from transportation to lumber business. This decision was prompted by the sense that the post-war economy was beginning to pick up. He sensibly thought that in Shizuoka, which had been completely flattened by bombing, wooden building materials would be in demand. He was, however, an inexperienced newcomer to the business, so things did not go so well. In 1951, out of the blue, a catastrophe occurred. Shunsaku was 17 years old at the time. An electrical fault started a fire at the company premises. Their house was 2.5 miles away, but they could still see the pillar of flame shooting up from the sawmill into the pitch-black night sky. Shunsaku rushed after his father towards the fire. Everything that his father had worked so hard to build up was being reduced to ashes right in front of their eyes. As the fire grew stronger, the best efforts of the fire brigade were quite unable to prevent the total reduction of the sawmill. 3 months later, they had somehow managed to resume the operation, but inevitably on a much reduced scale. They had to assume a mountain of debt and no longer able to buy large quantities of lumber. This was the overriding reason that they decided to switch from lumber seller to wooden model manufacturer. In 1953, they stopped selling building lumber material and relaunched themselves as a specialized wooden model kit maker. Then they began to produce models of battleships and gliders. Progress may have been slow, but the company was developing steadily. After Shunsaku graduated from high school, his parents sent him off to university in Tokyo. His father, however, imposed one unusual condition upon him. At the time, his father struggling with his business, although he would pay the tuition fees out of his own pocket, he was not able to pay Shunsaku's living expenses. Some of the firms he did business with in Tokyo owed him money, and so he proposed that Shunsaku will go to collect these debts. This should provide him with enough money to live on for the first 2 years or so. Shunsaku had never imagined that while still in his teens he would end up acting as a debt collector. He was just a boy fresh out of high school, not one of the companies even gave him the time of day. All of them gave him the brush off, saying, "We haven't the money to pay right now, so come back some other time." In the beginning, he used to just turn around and go back home empty-handed and heavy-hearted. The equation was simple: if the debts were not paid, he could not continue living in Tokyo. But giving up was out of the question. At that time he was living in rented accommodation where meals are also included. The rent was 6,000 yen a month. Even if he took on various jobs, there was still no way he could pay the sum all by himself. One day, after he had failed to pay his rent for several months, he found a note stuck on the door of his room. Until such time as he has paid his rent, it read, "Mr. Tamiya is not welcome in the communal dining area." He blushed so hard that his cheeks burned with shame. He knew that, at the very least, he had to get paid back enough money to cover his food costs. He never once grumbled to his parents, because he knew full well that they were a big family and that his father's business was struggling. He set off by streetcar, and after a long journey, he reached the place where one of the firms which owed them money was located. Their attitude was cold and unyielding as ever. But that day, he simply couldn't go home empty-handed. In fact, he doesn't even have enough for the fare home. The staff ignored him completely, but he ignored them right back and just stayed right where he was. Even the boss's wife moaned that she couldn't lock up with him there. Shunsaku held his ground. Then, the miracle of miracles, the woman muttered and said, "Well, just take this for today, and now get off home," and handed to him a 500 yen. It was the first time he had succeeded in getting repaid. He now started going off on his debt-collecting missions nearly every day. His rule was simple: if nothing else, be persistent, stick like a leech. The more he did it, the more he began to get used to it, but the feelings of humiliation never lessened. He was passionate that once he had graduated he was going to do something to help his family. But then again, another painful tragedy happened. In March 1958, just a few days before Shunsaku's graduation ceremony, his mother collapsed and was diagnosed as having acute leukemia. And 3 days later, early in the morning, his mother peacefully breathed her last. The tears welled up in his eyes and would not stop. He had 5 younger brothers, one of whom was still at elementary school. He swore that as the very least he could do to repay his mother for her sacrifices, he would do all his power to help his father to bring up the family. After the burial, he went to Tokyo to clean up his room and packed his things, and went back home to Shizuoka. Moving on, Shunsaku joined the family's business. His father assigned him to the planning and designing of new products. For a model lover like him, it was a great job. He was able to make commercial products out of the models that he personally wanted to make. All seemed to be going smoothly. The production was now a possibility and they were at last on track to become a serious model-making company. It was just at the point when Shunsaku began to feel that Tamiya company could make it as a model manufacturer. Something unexpected and shocking emerged from the United States. The painful switch to plastic. Plastic models were invented in England before the Second World War. But they only became generally available in 1951, when the American firm started to produce them. Plastic toys were already being made at that time, and with the idea that it might be fun to let consumers assemble the toys themselves, produced a model kit of a car. From that modest start, plastic models went on to spread throughout the United States and began to be imported into Japan from the mid-1950s. Consequently, a wave of plastic engulfed the everyday lives of Japanese people. Sales of wooden models began to slump. It was in 1959 that Shunsaku's father finally took the decision to move into the plastic model business. Unfortunately, they were completely devoid of the appropriate know-how or skills. But as they blundered around in ignorance, they decided to proceed in a rough and ready way, jumping straight from the drawing stage to the mold stage. But even when it came to drawing plans, they were out of their element. A different type of technical drawing was needed for plastic model making. And as a company that had specialized in making wooden models, they had absolutely no idea how to make metal mold. And most of all, the cost of all processing and the plastic resin material was quite expensive. But they never give up. The search for people who are capable to do the job is also difficult, but they succeeded. And the first plastic that they made was the model of the battleship Musashi. But the unthinkable happened. In 1960, they had reached the state when they could think about setting a date for the product launch. A model of the same battleship Musashi was put on sale by another company. And the thing that panicked them the most was the price. It was dramatically cheaper than their projected retail price. They launched their battleship in the market. But the result was a crushing defeat for them. Then they recycled the metal mold of Musashi to make the battleship Yamato and attempted to sell it as a new model. But that strategy failed too. Things were so bad that even Shunsaku's father, who was a tough man, began to lose heart. Employees began to leave in ones and twos. They don't even have the necessary capital to pay the mold for another plastic model. One day, a wholesaler who dealt in plastic resin advised them that if they couldn't afford to make new metal molds, they should think about reusing old molds for plastic toys. The guy showed them the molds. They were for small racing cars like the ones that are given away free with candy for kids. The cars could be rolled down little inclines or pushed along by hand. Shunsaku borrowed the molds, and they called the plastic products baby racers and baby trucks. The unit price of the baby races was very low, but they sold in great quantities. It was their strong performance that made it possible for them to start contemplating producing a second plastic mold. A year had passed since they made the battleship Musashi model. They produced the battle tank German Panther. And it was their first real success in the business. A worldwide search of information. The Tamiya spirit of creativity is continually endeavored to give the customer satisfaction and enjoyment of their hobbies. Tamiya radio-controlled models previously held 2 Guinness World Records, both for distances traveled. 1. Greatest distance by a radio-controlled model car on one set of batteries. 2. Greatest distance by a radio-controlled model car in 24 hours. Inspired by the commitment, first in quality around the world. From less than 50 employees to the current several hundred. From lumber seller to master modeler. Thank you so much for watching.